Shop Fix. It's for the love of woodworking. The first thing we need to cover are all the components of a table saw, and it's mainly for safety. So first is obviously the blade guard you see here. The blade guard is very important, especially if you're on the job site or ripping a lot of sheet goods or a lot of boards very quickly. And I would leave it on there as much as possible. However, it gets a little tricky when you're ripping thin material because the rip fence can't get any closer than about 1.5 inches. So that's why you see me a lot. I don't have this on there because I can get better control of the board without the bulky blade guard in front of the wood. And so I'll show you that a little bit later, but this one's really easy. It comes off super simple. Right off the back. And for a blade guard, this works really well. These just lift up and let the boards pass through. Very good blade guard. Okay, so let me show you how the anti-kickback works. So if I try to take this board and I slide it past the anti-kickback and then I try to pull it back, it locks. As a beginner, all the safety features come in handy because it just makes you more comfortable working on the table saw because it can be highly dangerous, but with all these safety features, it makes it a lot safer to use. And so that's going to be awesome, preventing that kickback. For the demonstration purposes of this video and for the rest of the video, we're going to be removing the blade guard. And we'll also be removing the anti-kickback design on the back here. Okay, last but certainly not least is the riving knife. And I say that because it's actually one of the most important safety features that you want to have on the table saw and at all times. I would never operate a table saw without the riving knife attached, unless you're doing a dado. Now, what does the riving knife do? Well, the riving knife prevents the wood from coming together after you've cut the kerf of the blade out and pinching. Especially when you're working with wood that has a lot of knots in it, when you cut that wood and you relieve the knot, that wood wants to come back together and it'll squeeze on that blade. And what the riving knife does, it prevents that wood from clinching up against the blade because instead it just rides on the back of the riving knife. So it just keeps that kerf open and the two pieces separate as you coming across the blade. There's two settings that the riving knife can be in. It can be a through cut, which a through cut riving knife position just means that the blade is passing all the way through the top of the lumber. And a non-through cut just means that the blade is resting inside the wood. One thing you'll never want to do is position the riving knife in a through cut position and then not have the blade go through the top. Because what will end up happening is as you start moving that piece of lumber across the blade, when you get to the riving knife will prevent the lumber from passing all the way through. And so you'll have to turn off the machine and back it out. I want to explain a few things that you should never do with the table saw. And the first being cross-cutting with the rip fence and gauge. So typically when you go to a cross-cut, you'll be using a miter gauge or something similar to that, and your offcut will always be free and clear off of the blade. However, if you go ahead and engage the rip fence, because let's say you think, oh, I want that exact measurement for my crosscut, so I'll just use the rip fence. Well, it seems like that will be fine. However, what happens is when you cut this out, the offcut is now jammed between the blade and the rip fence. And that's something you never want to happen because that's going to cause kickback. So let's say we're ripping this board out, okay? The offcut is on this side because it's free and clear of the fence. If I were to push the board through the blade and only hold on to the offcut side, this piece is going to get jammed between the blade and the rip fence and potentially cause kickback. So the piece that is between the blade and the rip fence always gets pushed through. Okay, so now you understand that you cannot cross-cut with the rip fence engaged, and your offcut is always on the side without the fence. So your offcut should never be between the blade and the rip fence. So now that we've covered that, you should also never cross-cut with just the fence. So let's say you have this board and you want to cross-cut this. Even if it's out here, this cut right here, This is a very unsafe cut because the piece has a tendency to wobble back and forth. So you can't cross-cut a thin board like this with just the rip fence, even though you're not using the miter gauge and the fence together. That is completely unsafe. Another thing that you should never do on a table saw is a freehand cut. So what I mean by a freehand cut is not utilizing the fence, the miter gauge, or some kind of jig to support the wood past the blade, and instead just using your hands and freely guiding this piece across the blade. This isn't a bandsaw or a jigsaw, this is a table saw, and we use table saw jigs to perform those type of cuts. Another thing that you should never do on a table saw is incorrectly feeding the board through the blade. A good rule of thumb is that if the board is thin, you can feed it faster. If the board is very thick and you're taking off a lot of material, then you're going to want to be feeding it slower. Now, one thing to keep in mind on a table saw, when you are feeding lumber, especially very thick lumber that has a lot of knots, sometimes it will jam. If it starts jamming up against the blade, just trying to force that material through the blade is going to put you in a very dangerous position. So you should never force any material through the blade. So you're probably asking yourself, well, what do I do if my material gets jammed in the blade and I'm forcing it through and it won't go any farther? Well, I'll tell you, you put your hand on the piece of wood and you go down and you shut your table saw off. And then you can either go ahead and cut it again, which oftentimes works because it widens that curve. And usually with the second pass, you're all good. Or you can flip the board around and cut it from the other side, and that works well. So all in all, never feed the board too fast. Don't feed it too slow or it'll burn the edge of the wood. And don't ever force material to the blade in case it gets jammed. You'll always want to turn your table saw off in that scenario. Another dangerous mistake you can make on a table saw is reaching for a thin offcut that shouldn't be reached for. So let's say I ripped this board out and I was left with this very thin offcut up against the blade. Now sometimes you'll have a tendency to reach for an offcut because it looks like it might kick back at you. If the offcut is on the free and clear side, so it's not jammed up between the blade and the fence, it has very low chance of kicking back at you with any kind of force that would hurt. So what kind of offcut can you reach for? Well, if an offcut is very thin but long, like this one, you can easily grab it from the end and pull it away from the blade and then make your next cut. Another instance where you could reach for an offcut is if it's very wide. So if this was my offcut, well, I have plenty of wood on this side that's away from the blade that I can easily remove that from the blade. The safest way to remove an offcut is to first shut off your table saw, and then you can pull the offcut and you don't ever run the risk of any kickback or getting your fingers too close to the blade. But there are some instances where you'll just leave the table saw on and you'll be cutting a lot of boards and you just want to remove the offcuts so they don't pile up. So that's everything you need to know about offcuts. When operating a table saw, I would never do so without the proper safety equipment. So this could include a dust mask, hearing protection, safety glasses, a push stick, and a woodworking apron. The main cuts on a table saw are utilizing the rip fence, and we're going to be ripping boards long ways. Two things about the board that you're ripping out. One, it needs to rest flat on the surface. So you can easily check that by setting the board down and then trying to rock it back and forth. If it rocks back and forth because of a bow or a cup, you're gonna have to either hand plane that or use a jointer to get that flat enough to where it's not rocking. And then another thing is the edge that you're ripping on needs to be as straight as possible. And what I mean by that is that it has to be parallel to the rip fence. And so ideally, you'll be using a jointer to joint one edge of the board so it can be perfectly parallel to the rip fence. And that's going to give you a nice safe cut. There's a few things I'd like to mention about the actual act of cutting and ripping on the table saw. Besides using a push stick, you'll also be pushing the lumber with your hands and positioning your body. There's two different ways I like to do this, and it depends on what I'm cutting. For this small lumber, I'd like to position myself to the left side of the blade so that I can put some pressure into the rip fence and also push it forward. Once it starts cutting, I'll just simply grab my push stick and then push it the rest of the way through with my body on the left side. A lot of the positioning is for safety. You don't want to be directly behind the blade and just pushing like this. I would not say that's the proper position. I would definitely say either you're pulling the board into the fence from the right, or you're pushing the board into the fence from the left. Okay, so now we've covered all the basics to make your first rip cut safely and effectively. And I want to show you another example here. And instead of using the push stick, we're going to be just pushing the lumber through the blade this time because we're going to be cutting it a little bit wider. So if you follow all the steps that I've taught so far, you'll be able to get a safe, accurate cut every time. And so that is the basic rip cut, just guiding the piece of wood along the rip fence across the blade to get a nice clean cut on the other side. If you need any more information on anything that I did in this video or any of the cuts that I performed, just leave me a comment. So, I wish you the best of luck on your future woodworking projects. Always stay safe on the table saw, and I'll see you in the next video.
Shop Fix. It's for the love of woodworking.